We are currently living in a postmodern society that has been teaching us relativistic concepts. So what is relativism? Well, if I had to summarize it with a quote, I would choose Frank Sinatra's "I did it my way." Right? Because relativism basically teaches this, that truth is unique to the individual person. So what may be true for one person isn't necessarily true for the other person. We get to choose our own truth. And they're basically talking about subjective truth. So subjective truth is basically opinions and preferences. So for example, if I was to say chocolate ice cream is the best in the world, well, they would say, well, sir, that might be true for you, but it may not be true for someone else. Maybe they think that vanilla ice cream is the best in the world. See, when I say chocolate ice cream is the best in the world, maybe that's my preference or my opinion or something like that, and someone else may have a different preference or opinion in the same matter. So my truth is not necessarily their truth. That's what they're talking about. However, though we don't deny that, there is such thing as objective truth, which relativism does deny. They say there's no such thing as truth that applies to everyone. Truth is relative to the individual. It's unique to the individual. No one necessarily needs to have the same truth, stuff like that. However, for example, if I was to say God exists, well, the relativist would say, well, sir, God may exist for you, but he doesn't exist for me. How does that make sense? How can God exist only for me? How can God's existence only be applied to me and not to everyone else? Right? Either God exists, and that's true for everyone, or he doesn't exist, and that's true for everyone. It can't be that he exists for one and not for the other. That doesn't make sense. So there is such thing as objective truth, and that does apply in theological concepts. So with that in mind, what about worship? How does God accept all forms of worship? Because remember, with relativism, it teaches us that, hey, truth is up to you. You get to decide what's right or wrong. So when it comes to worship, they say you worship the way you want to worship. The other persons can worship the way that they want to worship, and you're all right. God accepts all form of worship, things like that. So it would be up to the individual according to a relativistic worldview, things like that. But is that true? Does God accept all forms of worship? Well, no. According to the Bible, there are many times where God did not accept certain people's worship. For example, Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel both decided we're going to worship God through a sacrifice. They both sacrificed different things, and as a result, God only accepted one of their sacrifices. He didn't accept Cain's sacrifice. And then you get to the book of Exodus, and the children of Israel, they just left the land of Egypt. They'd just been delivered by God out of the land of Egypt, and Moses, he's up getting the 2 tablets, and the children of Israel down there for like 40 days, and they're like, you know what? We've decided we want to worship God the way the other nations worship God. We're going to make a graven image, we're going to make an idol, and we're going to worship him that way. And the relativists, they would say, yeah, that makes sense. You can worship him however you want. It's up to you as an individual, or as an individual nation, I guess. So they decide, we're going to worship God the way the other nations worship him. We're going to make him as an image. And they did that, and then they started worshiping this golden image. It was a golden calf, worshiping it as though this was the God that brought them out of the Egypt. They said, oh, this great God that delivered us out of the hands of the Egyptians. And they start having a sensual and sexual type of lustful worship ceremony thing. And God tells Moses, Moses, get down there. They are doing some bad things. So Moses gets down there, and honestly, a lot of people died that day because God wasn't happy with the fact that they were trying to worship him in ways that he did not want to be worshiped. So it makes it very obvious God does not want to be worshiped in certain ways. So we can't accept this idea that you can just worship God however you want and he'll accept it. God wants to be worshiped in certain ways, and he accepts certain worship and he doesn't accept certain worship. So how can we know what kind of worship God's going to accept and which ones he's going to deny? Well, how do you know what kind of gifts to buy your best friend? You get to know your best friend, and then you know exactly what they're going to want. In much the same way with God, if you know God well, you'll know what he wants. So how can we get to know God better? By studying his word, by praying, by seeking his advice, things like that. If we're not going to do the work to try and get to know God, then we can't come up with the excuse to say, God, I didn't know that you didn't want to be worshiped that way, or something like that. God gave us what we needed to know, and he expects us to try and learn more about him, just as we would try to learn more about our best friend if we were going to try and buy them a gift and try to honor them. All right, so I'm not going to give you all the answers for how God wants you to worship. I would ask that you would read the Bible for yourself, pray about it, try and find ways in which God would want you to worship him. And he wants us to honor him not just with our actions, but also with our hearts. So hopefully that makes sense.